Witness this. A 14-year-old boy sits in a palace that isn't his, wearing robes that don't fit, holding a pen that will end an empire. The year is 476. The place is Ravenna, not Rome, because Rome hasn't mattered for decades. The boy's name is Romulus Augustulus, a name that carries the weight of 7 centuries, the founder and the first emperor combined into one small, terrified body. His hands are shaking. Across the table stands Odoacer, a Germanic warlord with mud still on his boots, a man who commands the same mercenary army that was supposed to protect this child. Odoacer doesn't want the throne. That's the detail nobody remembers. He wants the boy to sign a letter, just a few lines of Latin, sending the imperial regalia to Constantinople. The crown, the scepter, the purple cloak, ship them east. Tell the emperor in Constantinople that the West doesn't need an emperor anymore. Romulus signs. His signature is shaky, like a schoolboy's. He's given a pension, 6,000 gold coins a year, and a villa in Campania where he can live out his days in comfortable obscurity. No execution, no dungeon, just paperwork. The Roman Empire, the greatest civilization the world had ever seen, the empire of Caesar and Augustus and Marcus Aurelius, ends with a teenager's signature and a retirement package. This wasn't a conquest. This was a foreclosure. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy the hidden truths of history, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. To understand why a boy's signature could kill an empire, you have to understand that the empire was already dead. It just hadn't stopped breathing. The collapse didn't happen in 476. That was just the death certificate. The patient had been hemorrhaging for a century, and everyone who could read the vital signs knew it. Start with the army. By the time Romulus sat on that throne, the Roman military hadn't been Roman for generations. The legions that once conquered Gaul and Britain and Egypt, the disciplined infantry that built roads and walls and crushed every enemy they faced, those legions existed only in memory. What remained were mercenaries, Germanic warriors, Huns, Goths, men who fought for Rome because Rome paid them, and Rome paid them because Rome had forgotten how to fight for itself. The empire had outsourced its survival, and now the contractors were demanding equity. Odoacer's men hadn't been paid in 18 months. They'd asked for land, 1/3 of Italy, a reasonable demand by the standards of the time. They were refused, so they did what any unpaid workforce does when management won't negotiate. They restructured the company. But here's what the schoolbooks won't tell you. Romulus Augustulus wasn't even supposed to be emperor. His father, a general named Orestes, had seized power the year before, installing his teenage son as a puppet while he ran things from behind the curtain. Orestes was the one who refused to pay the mercenaries. Orestes was the one who thought he could hold an empire together with empty promises and borrowed time. When the soldiers turned on him, they killed Orestes. They spared the boy. Even barbarians, it seems, had a sense of proportion. Romulus hadn't done anything wrong. He was just born too late. The villa in Campania still exists, or at least its ruins do. We don't know when Romulus died there. History doesn't record it. He might have lived another 50 years, growing old in a garden while the world his ancestors built crumbled around him. He might have watched the Ostrogoths take Italy, watched the Vandals sack what was left of Rome, watched the roads crack and the aqueducts run dry. Or he might have died young, of fever or accident or simple despair. Nobody thought to write it down. The last Western Roman emperor vanished from history the same way the empire did, not with a bang, but with a shrug. And that's the first lie we have to kill. The fall of Rome wasn't a fall. It wasn't barbarians at the gates, wasn't a single catastrophic battle, wasn't some dramatic last stand where brave Romans died defending their civilization against the darkness. The darkness was already inside. It had been inside for generations. What happened in 476 was more like a coroner pronouncing time of death on a body that had been cooling for decades. Consider what collapse actually looked like. Not the political collapse, the signed documents and the shifted crowns. The real collapse. The infrastructure collapse. The end of everything that made Roman life Roman. The roads cracked first. Rome had built 50,000 miles of paved highways, engineered surfaces that connected every corner of the empire, that let soldiers march from Britain to Syria in weeks instead of months. Those roads required maintenance. They required crews, funding, coordination, a functioning state. By 500, the crews were gone. The funding had evaporated. The coordination was a joke. Weeds pushed through the paving stones. Bridges collapsed and weren't rebuilt. A journey that took 2 weeks under the empire now took 2 months, assuming you survived the bandits. Then, the aqueducts. Rome's water system was the most sophisticated on Earth, 11 aqueducts feeding the capital, enough fresh water for 1 million people, for public baths and fountains and the kind of sanitation that wouldn't exist again until the 19th century. The Goths cut the aqueducts during sieges. Nobody repaired them. By 550, Romans were drinking from the Tiber, the same river they'd used as a sewer for 500 years. Then the literacy. This one hurts the most. In the year 400, even merchants could read. Even farmers signed their names. The empire ran on paperwork, on contracts and receipts and legal documents, on the written word as the operating system of civilization. By 600, kings were signing with an X, not metaphorically, literally. Charlemagne himself, 3 centuries later, never fully learned to write. The infrastructure for teaching people to read, the schools, the teachers, the books, the social expectation that reading mattered, all of it dissolved. 1,000 years of accumulated knowledge became inaccessible to the very people who needed it most. The population of Rome tells the story in numbers. 1 million people in the year 100. That's larger than any city in Europe would be until London in the 1800s. 1 million people, fed by grain ships from Egypt, entertained by gladiators and chariot races, living in apartment blocks and shopping in markets and arguing about politics in forums. By 550, maybe 30,000 remained. Not because of plague, not because of war, but because the grain ships stopped coming, and there was nothing to eat. A city built for 1 million became a village of survivors camping in the ruins, using marble columns as fence posts, building cooking fires in the homes of senators. This was the ancient equivalent of losing the internet, the power grid, and the supply chain all at once. Except there was no backup, no cloud storage, no manual. Just people who remembered their grandparents talking about hot baths and paved roads in a world that made sense. The technology loss alone should stagger you. Romans had concrete that set underwater, a formula so advanced we didn't rediscover it until the 20th century. They had central heating, hypocausts that pumped hot air under floors. They had indoor plumbing. By 700, the most powerful kings in Europe lived in wooden halls with holes in the roof for smoke and servants carrying chamber pots. The regression wasn't gradual, it was total. Britain shows the pattern most clearly. The Romans left in 410, called home to defend Italy, promising to return. They never did. The last new Roman building in Britain was constructed around that year. The next stone buildings appeared around 670, 2.5 centuries later. For 260 years, the most advanced construction technology on the island was wood and thatch. Pottery quality collapsed so dramatically that archaeologists can date sites just by looking at how crude the bowls are. The population cratered from 4 million to perhaps under 1 million. Not invasion, not conquest, abandonment. The system that fed and organized and protected 4 million people simply evaporated, and without it, 3 million people ceased to exist. And here's what you need to understand about the people who remained. They knew. They absolutely knew they were living in a lesser age. They called themselves moderni, modern, and they called the empire antiqui, ancient. They weren't stupid. They weren't ignorant. They looked at the aqueducts and the roads and the ruins of the forums, and they understood that their ancestors had built something magnificent, something beyond their own capacity to replicate or even maintain. The weight of that knowledge must have been crushing. Imagine inheriting a mansion and watching it rot around you because you've lost the instruction manual, the repair crew, the money, and the skills all at once. So what did survivors do? The same thing survivors always do. They adapted. With the state gone, the question became brutally simple. Who protects you? The old answer was the legions, the emperor, the law. The new answer was whoever was standing closest with a sword. Local strongmen emerged, warlords who could defend a valley or a town. Some were Roman nobles clinging to old titles. Some were Germanic chieftains who'd settled on Roman land. Some were bishops, because the church was the only institution left with any organizational structure, any literacy, any network that crossed what used to be borders. And you pledged loyalty to whoever could stop the next raiding party from burning your farm. This wasn't a political philosophy. It was desperate improvisation. The church survived because the church had something no one else did: continuity. When the empire collapsed, the bishops remained. When the schools closed, the monasteries kept copying manuscripts. When the law courts vanished, canon law, church law, filled the vacuum. A bishop in 500 wasn't just a religious figure. He was the judge, the administrator, the only literate person in the region, the last connection to a civilization that had otherwise disappeared. The medieval church's power didn't come from divine right. It came from being the last institution standing. In a monastery scriptorium, candlelight flickering, a monk bends over a sheet of vellum. He's copying Virgil. He doesn't fully understand the Latin, which has drifted over the centuries, but he copies it anyway, letter by letter, because someone told him these words mattered. On the next table, another monk copies agricultural manuals. On the next, medical texts. They're preserving knowledge they can barely use, in languages they barely speak, for a future they can't imagine. This is how civilization survives its own death, one copied page at a time, by people who don't know if anyone will ever read it again. Gregory of Tours, writing around 580, captured the mood perfectly, a single line that tells you everything. The study of letters is dying. No one remains who can set down the deeds of the present. He was wrong, of course. He was setting down the deeds of the present. But he felt like the last one. That feeling, that sense of being at the end of something irreplaceable, defined the early medieval world. They called the previous age a golden age. They called their own age iron. They waited for Rome to come back, the way a child waits for a parent who isn't coming. Rome didn't come back. But something else happened instead. The rubble started to move. The survivors started building, not rebuilding. That's the crucial distinction. Nobody was trying to resurrect the empire. That dream was dead. They were building something new, with whatever materials they could scavenge from the wreckage. Germanic law codes mixed with Roman legal fragments. Christian theology mixed with pagan traditions. Latin mixed with local languages until it became something else entirely, became French and Spanish and Italian, and became the vernacular tongues of nations that didn't exist yet. The synthesis was messy, violent, contradictory. It was also alive. It was growing. Look at the map of Europe in 500, and you see chaos. A dozen kingdoms carved from imperial territory, Franks in Gaul, Visigoths in Spain, Ostrogoths in Italy, Angles and Saxons pouring into Britain. These aren't countries yet. They're warlords with ambitions and short lifespans. But they're also seeds. Some of these kingdoms will become France, England, Germany, Spain. The borders they're drawing with swords will persist for 15 centuries. They don't know this. They think they're just surviving. 300 years after Romulus signed his name and disappeared into history, a Frankish warlord named Charles will do something unthinkable. He'll try to put the empire back together. Not the Roman Empire, not really, but something that wears its clothes. He'll conquer most of Western Europe, get crowned by the Pope, call himself emperor. He'll fail eventually, the way everyone fails eventually. But what he builds won't entirely disappear. It'll fragment and reform and fragment again. And somewhere in that process, the medieval world will stop apologizing for itself and start believing it has the right to exist. Everyone who survived the fall knew they were living in diminished times. They measured themselves against a past they couldn't match. But their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would forget, slowly, what had been lost. They'd look at the cathedrals their ancestors built and see them as timeless, not as desperate improvisations. They'd mistake the makeshift for the permanent, and in that forgetting, they'd find the confidence to build something the Romans never imagined. The darkness had one advantage. It freed them from comparison. But before the building could begin, before the cathedrals and the kingdoms and the slow return of something resembling civilization, there was only the collapse, only the ruined roads and the empty cities and the long silence where literacy used to be. Only a boy in a villa, watching his pension payments dwindle, wondering if anyone remembered his name. Romulus Augustulus probably died in obscurity. We'll never know for certain. But somewhere in the shadows of that crumbling world, a monk was copying a manuscript. Somewhere a warlord was swearing loyalty to a bishop. Somewhere a peasant was learning that the empire wasn't coming to save them, that salvation, if it came at all, would have to be improvised. The Middle Ages didn't begin with a coronation or a battle. They began with that realization, that moment when survival became the only agenda and everything else, glory, legacy, the weight of history, became luxury. What happens next is the story of 1,000 years of improvisation, building from bones. And it starts with a question that Romulus never had to answer, but everyone who came after him did. When the world you knew disappears, what do you build from the wreckage? Forget the paintings. Forget the gilded illustrations in medieval manuscripts showing a serene emperor with a golden crown and a wise expression. Forget the Renaissance portraits that made Charlemagne look like a philosopher king, draped in ermine, radiating divine authority. The man who rebuilt Western civilization was a barbarian. He spoke Frankish, a Germanic dialect that sounded harsh to Roman ears. He ate with his hands, gorged on roasted meat, kept multiple wives and concubines, and personally led cavalry charges into enemy formations well into his 60s. He couldn't write. He tried to learn as an adult, kept wax tablets under his pillow to practice his letters at night, and never mastered the skill. The greatest emperor since Rome fell signed documents with a monogram because his fingers couldn't form the words. This is the man who saved Western civilization. This is also the man who ordered 4,500 prisoners beheaded in a single day. Both things are true. If that makes you uncomfortable, you're beginning to understand the Middle Ages. The world Charlemagne inherited in 768 was not a world that wanted to be unified. It was a patchwork of violence, a landscape defined by what had been lost and what remained. The Roman roads still existed, cracked and overgrown, but passable. The river system still carried trade, diminished but functioning. The old provincial boundaries still meant something, even if the provinces had become kingdoms with new names and new masters. But the connective tissue that had made Rome an empire, the bureaucracy, the professional army, the shared currency, the expectation that law applied equally from Britain to Syria, all of that was gone. What remained were armed men claiming territory and other armed men trying to take it from them. The Frankish kingdom that Charlemagne inherited was the strongest of these successor states, but strongest is a relative term. His father Papal had done the hard work of establishing the Carolingian dynasty, deposing the old Merovingian kings and securing papal blessing for the usurpation. Pepin had also forged an alliance with Rome that would define European politics for centuries. The Pope needed military protection from the Lombards in Italy. The Franks needed legitimacy that only the Church could provide. The exchange was simple: swords for sanctity. Charlemagne inherited this alliance, this kingdom, this ambition. He also inherited a problem that would consume 32 years of his reign and reveal exactly what kind of man he was. Picture the Frankish court in 772. Not a palace in the Roman sense, not marble halls and heated floors. A wooden complex, large but rustic, filled with hunting dogs and armed retainers and the smell of roasting meat. The king is 30 years old, tall by the standards of his time, reportedly 6'4", in an era when the average man stood 5'6". He's already campaigned in Italy, already conquered the Lombard kingdom, already demonstrated that he can project power across the Alps. But the map on his table, if he had such a thing, would show a gap. To the northeast, beyond the Rhine, lay Saxony. The Saxons were everything the Franks had stopped being: pagan, fiercely independent, organized into tribes rather than kingdoms. They worshipped the old Germanic gods and sacrificed to sacred groves and believed that the Frankish king had no authority over them. They raided Frankish territory when they felt strong and retreated into their forests when the Franks struck back. They'd been a problem for Charlemagne's father and grandfather. They would become Charlemagne's obsession. Why Saxony? The official reason was religion. The Saxons were heathens, and bringing them to Christ was a sacred duty. But religion was never separate from politics in this world. The Saxons controlled territory that connected Frankish lands to the North Sea, to the trade routes that linked Europe to Scandinavia and beyond. They represented a permanent threat on the Frankish flank, a population that could ally with any enemy, that could never be trusted to stay quiet. And they were, in a sense, a mirror. They showed what the Franks had been before Christianity and Rome softened them. Conquering Saxony wasn't just expansion. It was the Franks conquering their own past. The first campaign came in 772. Charlemagne crossed into Saxon territory, destroyed the Irminsul, the great sacred pillar that the Saxons believed held up the sky, and extracted oaths of submission from the tribal leaders. Then he left to deal with other problems, and the Saxons immediately revolted. This pattern would repeat for 3 decades: invasion, submission, revolt, invasion. The Saxons couldn't defeat the Frankish army in open battle, but they didn't need to. They could fade into forests the Franks couldn't penetrate, wait until the army withdrew, and emerge to slaughter the garrisons and missionaries left behind. By 782, Charlemagne had lost patience with the cycle. A Saxon uprising that year had killed a Frankish army and destroyed years of work. The king's response was calculated, methodical, and horrifying. At a place called Verdun, on the banks of the Aller River, Charlemagne assembled 4,500 Saxon prisoners. These weren't warriors captured in battle. They were men who had surrendered, who had submitted, who had perhaps expected enslavement or ransom or the usual currency of medieval defeat. What they got was execution. All of them, in a single day. The chronicles don't describe the logistics, and perhaps that's merciful. But someone had to organize the killing. Someone had to dig the pits. Someone had to keep count. Verdun wasn't a massacre in the heat of battle. It was policy. It was a message written in blood, communicating to every Saxon chieftain exactly what resistance would cost. Modern observers call it genocide, and they're not wrong. Charlemagne's own chroniclers recorded it without apparent shame as a necessary measure against a stubborn enemy. They must be conquered until they submit to the Christian faith or be entirely wiped out. Those words, attributed to Charlemagne by his biographer Einhard, sound like fanaticism. They were also strategy. The Saxon Wars weren't about converting individual souls. They were about breaking a society so thoroughly that it could be remade in the Frankish image. The legal code Charlemagne imposed on conquered Saxony prescribed death for refusing baptism, for eating meat during Lent, for cremating the dead in the pagan fashion. Christianity wasn't offered as a choice. It was imposed as a system of control, and the penalty for opting out was death. The Saxon Wars lasted until 804, 32 years, an entire generation born and raised in continuous conflict. By the end, tens of thousands were dead, and tens of thousands more had been forcibly relocated across the empire, scattered among Frankish populations where they couldn't organize resistance. The survivors were Christian, or at least performed Christianity convincingly enough to avoid execution. The sacred groves were burned. The old gods were forbidden. Saxony was absorbed into the Frankish kingdom and would eventually become the heartland of medieval Germany. This was how civilization was rebuilt, not through persuasion, not through cultural exchange, not through the gradual spread of good ideas, through violence so systematic and so complete that resistance became impossible. Charlemagne created order by eliminating everyone who refused to accept it. And then, on Christmas Day in the year 800, something happened that would reshape European history for 1,000 years. Charlemagne was in Rome. He'd come to rescue Pope Leo III, who had been attacked by a Roman mob the year before, accused of adultery and perjury, nearly killed in the street. The accusations were probably true. Leo was not a particularly virtuous man, and the Roman aristocracy had reasons to want him gone. But Charlemagne needed the Pope, and the Pope needed Charlemagne. And so the king came to Rome with an army and restored Leo to his throne. The Christmas Mass at St. Peter's Basilica was meant to be a celebration of this restoration. Charlemagne knelt to pray. Leo approached him with a crown. What happened next became the subject of debate that hasn't ended in 12 centuries. According to the official story told by Einhard, Charlemagne was surprised by the coronation. If he'd known Leo was going to crown him emperor, he never would have entered the church. This is almost certainly propaganda. You don't bring an army to Rome and kneel before the Pope on Christmas Day without knowing something is being planned. But the propaganda itself reveals the tension. Charlemagne wanted to be emperor. He didn't want to be emperor because the Pope made him one. The distinction matters. If the Pope could make emperors, the Pope could unmake them. If imperial authority flowed from papal blessing, then the Church stood above the state. The question of who was supreme, emperor or Pope, would generate wars for the next 500 years. It was present in the room at St. Peter's, in the careful choreography of who stood where and who knelt to whom. The crowd shouted the acclamation to Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and peace-giving emperor, life and victory. The words were Roman, borrowed from ceremonies that hadn't been performed in the West for 3 centuries. The title was Roman, Emperor of the Romans. Never mind that there already was a Roman emperor in Constantinople, ruling a continuous empire that had never fallen. Never mind that Charlemagne didn't speak Latin or Greek, couldn't read the literature he claimed to inherit, ruled a kingdom that would have seemed barbaric to any actual Roman. The West was declaring independence. It was saying, "We don't need your legitimacy anymore. We'll make our own." The Byzantine Empress Irene, who ruled Constantinople at the time, was not consulted. Later, Charlemagne would propose marriage to her, a union that would have reunited the Roman Empire in a way no one expected. She was overthrown before she could respond. The opportunity vanished. East and West would continue their slow drift apart, becoming different civilizations that shared a common ancestor and an uncommon hostility. But in the moment, in that church, with that crown on his head, Charlemagne was something that hadn't existed since 476. He was a Western emperor. The idea that had seemed dead when young Romulus signed his name in Ravenna was alive again, transformed, barbarized, but alive. What did Charlemagne actually rule? The question sounds simple. The answer reveals everything about why the medieval world worked the way it did. On paper, his empire stretched from the Spanish March to the borders of Denmark, from the English Channel to Rome. It included modern France, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Austria, northern Italy, and pieces of Spain and Eastern Europe. By the standards of the post-Roman West, this was enormous. By the standards of Rome itself, it was a fragment. But size on a map meant nothing without the ability to govern. And here's where the medieval world diverged from its Roman predecessor so fundamentally that they barely resembled each other. Rome had bureaucrats, thousands of them, educated administrators who could be sent anywhere in the empire and would implement the same policies using the same procedures. Rome had a professional army, soldiers who served for decades, who were paid in cash, who owed loyalty to the state rather than to individual commanders. Rome had a tax system that could extract revenue from the entire Mediterranean and redistribute it where needed. Rome had roads maintained by public works departments and a postal service that could move messages faster than any medieval equivalent. Charlemagne had none of this. He had personal loyalty. The empire was divided into perhaps 300 counties, each ruled by a count, who was not an employee but a local strongman, co-opted into the system. Counts were usually men who already had power in their regions, men with armed followers and fortified homes, men who would fight for the king when summoned and administer justice in the king's name when asked. In exchange, they kept most of the revenue from their counties and passed their positions to their sons. This wasn't bureaucracy. It was franchising. To check on the counts, Charlemagne sent missi dominici, traveling inspectors who would ride circuits through the empire, investigating complaints, correcting abuses, reminding everyone that the king was watching. In theory, This maintained control. In practice, it maintained control only as long as the king was strong enough to punish counts who ignored the inspectors. The system ran on reputation, on the credible threat that Charles would personally lead an army to your county if you got out of line. It required a king who could be everywhere, who knew everything, who never showed weakness. Below the counts, the land was organized into manors. A lord with an estate, peasants bound to work that estate, the exchange of labor for protection that would harden over the centuries into serfdom. This wasn't a policy Charlemagne invented. It was the reality he inherited, the way human beings had organized themselves in the absence of a functioning state. The strong man with the sword protects the village feeds the strong man. The arrangement is terrible for the village, but the alternative, no protection at all, is worse. The church was the only institution with anything resembling organizational continuity. Monasteries maintained records, educated the few children who would learn to read, preserved manuscripts, ran the only hospitals and schools that existed. Charlemagne mandated that every cathedral establish a school, and this mandate actually worked, at least partially, because the church had the infrastructure to implement it. The literacy that would eventually revive in Europe was kept on life support in monastery scriptoriums, where monks copied texts they barely understood, letter by letter, preserving knowledge for a future they couldn't imagine. This was the system, not a state in any modern sense, a web of personal relationships, bound by oath and enforced by violence, held together by the sheer force of one man's will. It worked as long as that man was alive and capable. The moment he weakened, the whole structure would begin to collapse. Charlemagne knew this. He spent his final years trying to secure the succession, trying to ensure that what he'd built would survive him. He outlived most of his sons, which simplified some problems and created others. When he finally died in 814, at 70 years old, his empire passed to his one surviving legitimate son, Louis, called the Pious. Louis was not his father. He was educated, devout, more interested in theology than warfare. He was not weak, exactly, but he lacked Charles's terrifying charisma, on the sense that this was a man who had personally killed enemies in battle and would do so again if you crossed him. The counts noticed. The ambitious noticed. The empire held together for Louis's lifetime mostly, though it began to fray at the edges. And then Louis's sons went to war with each other. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 divided the Carolingian Empire into 3 parts. The western portion would become France. The eastern portion would become Germany. The middle strip, running from the North Sea to Rome, would be fought over for the next 1,000 years, producing wars that didn't stop until 1945. The names Lorraine and Burgundy and Italy mark the battlefields where this inheritance was contested, generation after generation, by men who claimed descent from Charlemagne and used that claim to justify slaughter. But the division wasn't the worst of it. The worst of it came from the sea. The Vikings appeared at the end of the 8th century, just as Charlemagne's empire was reaching its height. The first recorded raid hit the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793, a shock that resonated across Christian Europe. The raiders came from Scandinavia, from lands so remote that the Franks barely knew they existed, and they came for treasure. Monasteries were perfect targets. They had gold and silver accumulated from centuries of donations. They had no walls. Their inhabitants were men who had sworn not to fight. It was like robbing a bank with no guards and no locks. The raids intensified after Charlemagne's death. The divided kingdoms couldn't coordinate defense. A Viking fleet could appear at the mouth of a river. I sail upstream faster than messengers could carry warning, strike a monastery or town, and disappear before any army could respond. Paris was besieged in 845 and paid a ransom of 7,000 pounds of silver to make the Vikings leave. They left and came back and were paid again. The pattern repeated across Europe for 2 centuries. The response changed everything. If the central kingdoms couldn't protect you, you protected yourself. Local lords built fortifications, first wooden palisades, then stone towers, then full castles with walls and moats and keeps. By the year 900, the landscape of Europe was transforming. Power that had been centralized, however weakly, under Charlemagne was dispersing to whoever could build a stronghold and defend it. The castle wasn't just a military technology, it was a political statement. The man in the castle didn't need the king's permission to exist. He had walls, he had armed men. He could wait out any siege the weakened royal authorities might attempt. The feudal system, which had always tended toward local power, now had architecture to match. The king became first among equals at best, a figurehead at worst, while the real power rested with whoever controlled the fortifications. Nearly 10,000 castles would dot the French landscape by the year 1100. Each one represented a claim to local sovereignty, a declaration that the man inside owed loyalty to his lord, perhaps, but could negotiate the terms of that loyalty from behind stone walls. This was the wreckage of Charlemagne's dream. The empire that was supposed to revive Rome instead dissolved into a constellation of armed camps, then each one a tiny kingdom unto itself, connected by webs of obligation that could be honored or ignored depending on the balance of force. And yet, something survived. Not the empire, not the centralized power, not the dream of unity, but something. The church survived, battered by Vikings, corrupted by local politics, infiltrated by noble families who saw bishoprics as sources of revenue rather than spiritual office. The church nonetheless maintained its network, its literacy, its claim to speak for God. When kings were weak, bishops filled the vacuum. When law failed, canon law provided an alternative. When education collapsed everywhere else, monastery schools kept it breathing. The idea of Christian kingship survived. Every petty lord who built a castle and claimed independence still acknowledged, in theory, that he was part of Christendom, that there was a moral order above the clash of swords, that somewhere there was a pope who spoke for God, and an ideal of Christian rule that even the most brutal warrior was supposed to aspire to. And the county system survived, transformed. The counts who had been Charlemagne's administrators became the dukes and princes of the new order, their offices hereditary, their power local, but their titles descended from the framework Charles had imposed. The map of medieval Europe, the borders that would generate wars for centuries, was drawn in the Carolingian era and never entirely erased. Charlemagne had tried to resurrect Rome and failed. What he actually created was the scaffolding for something else, something that would take 2 more centuries to mature. The pieces were in place: the church, the lords, the castles, the theoretical unity of Christendom, the practical disunity of armed men in fortified homes. The system was unstable, violent, fragmented, but it was also, improbably, growing. By the year 950, the worst of the Viking raids were ending. Some raiders had settled down, become Christian, founded kingdoms of their own in Normandy and Sicily and Russia. The climate was warming. New agricultural techniques were spreading. The population, which had crashed after Rome and barely recovered under the Carolingians, was beginning to climb. The survivors of the collapse, the descendants of barbarians and Romans, and everyone in between, had spent 5 centuries improvising. They had built a world from the wreckage of another world, using whatever materials they could find, making mistakes that killed thousands, finding solutions that would outlast empires. They had no idea what they were building. They were just trying to survive. But survival, repeated long enough, becomes something else. It becomes a foundation. The year 1000 was approaching. The apocalypse that some expected didn't come. And in its place, something unprecedented began. A civilization that would build higher than Rome, reach farther than Rome, and believe, with the confidence of people who had forgotten how close they came to extinction, that God Himself had blessed their rise. The growing would come with a price. Everything in the Middle Ages came with a price. The sun rose on January 1st in the year 1000, and the world did not end. This matters more than you might think. Across Europe, in stone churches and wooden chapels, in monasteries perched on cliffsides and cathedrals rising from market towns, people had gathered to pray through the night. Not everyone believed the apocalypse was coming. That's a myth that later centuries invented to make medieval people seem more superstitious than they were. But enough believed. Enough had heard the sermons about the 1,000-year reign before Christ's return. Enough had counted the years since the Incarnation and wondered if time itself was running out. They prayed. They confessed. They waited for the sky to crack open. Dawn came. Birds sang. The world continued. And something shifted. Not in theology, not in politics, but in psychology. A civilization that had spent 5 centuries apologizing for itself, measuring itself against Roman ruins it couldn't replicate, suddenly found permission to believe it might have a future. The year 1000 didn't cause the transformation that followed, but it marked the moment when medieval Europe stopped waiting for the end and started building for permanence. What they built in the next 3 centuries would dwarf anything Rome had achieved, and what they built would kill them. Here's what changed in the fields first, because everything in the medieval world started in the fields. 3 innovations, none of them glamorous, all of them revolutionary. The heavy plow, with its iron blade that could cut through the dense clay soils of northern Europe, soils the Roman scratch plow couldn't touch. The horse collar, which let horses pull without choking, replacing oxen with animals 3 times faster. And the 3-field rotation system, leaving one field fallow each year while the others produced spring and winter crops, squeezing 50% more food from the same land. These weren't inventions in the modern sense. They were accumulations, refinements, the kind of progress that happens so slowly no one notices until suddenly the granaries are overflowing. By 1100, Europe was producing more food per acre than it ever had. By 1200, the surplus was transforming everything. More food meant more people. More people meant more labor. More labor meant more land could be cleared, more forests felled, more marshes drained, more fields carved from wilderness. Europe's population doubled between the year 1000 and the year 1300. 35 million people became 70 million, and 70 million people needed to be fed, housed, organized, and above all, controlled. And this is where the system came in. Not a system anyone designed, not a philosophy someone wrote down and others followed. A system that emerged from necessity, from the simple, brutal question that had haunted Europe since Rome fell. Who protects you? The answer, by the High Middle Ages, had crystallized into something historians would later call feudalism, though the people who lived it never used that word. They called it custom. They called it loyalty. They called it the way things were. Picture a ceremony. A man kneels before another man, his hands clasped and raised, placed between the hands of the one who receives them. He swears an oath. He pledges his loyalty, his service, his sword. In exchange, he receives land, protection, a place in a hierarchy that stretches from the peasant in the mud to the king on his throne and beyond, unto God himself. This was homage. This was the ritual that bound medieval society into a single organism, every person connected to every other person through chains of obligation and debt. The theory was elegant. The king ruled by God's grace, owing loyalty only to heaven. The great lords, the dukes and counts, held their lands from the king in exchange for military service and counsel. The lesser lords, the knights and barons, held their lands from the great lords on similar terms. And the peasants, the vast majority, held their tiny strips of farmland from the local lord in exchange for labor, for a portion of their crops, for fees at every milestone of life, marriage, death, the use of the Lord's mill to grind their grain. Everyone owed something to someone. Everyone was owed something by someone else. The pyramid was complete. In the reality was messier. Lords fought lords constantly, disputing boundaries, inheritance, honor. Obligations were interpreted, stretched, betrayed, renegotiated at sword point. A vassal might owe loyalty to 3 different lords who were at war with each other, and the legal tangles that resulted could take generations to unwind. The system that was supposed to prevent violence often sanctified it. Private wars between nobles killed more people in most years than the Crusades ever did. But it worked. Not perfectly, not justly, but functionally. It produced enough order for trade to resume, for towns to grow, for cathedrals to rise. It gave everyone a role, a status, a place in a structure that claimed divine sanction. And for the people at the bottom, the serfs bound to the land, unable to leave or marry or sell without their lord's permission, it offered something that might have looked like security if you squinted. You couldn't be evicted. You were protected, at least in theory, from raiders and invaders. You had a place. The place was near the bottom of a hierarchy designed to extract your labor, but it was a place. A knight's equipment tells you everything about medieval economics. The horse alone cost as much as 20 oxen, more than most peasant villages owned collectively. The armor, the weapons, the years of training, the land required to support it all. This was a military system that required massive surplus extraction from the peasantry. Every knight represented hundreds of peasant families laboring to keep him mounted and armed. The feudal system wasn't an arrangement of mutual obligation. It was a protection racket that had developed a theology. This wasn't oppression dressed up as tradition. It was oppression that had genuinely become tradition, that everyone involved believed was ordained by God, that peasants defended as fiercely as lords because the alternative, the chaos of the post-Roman centuries, the memory of a world where no one was safe, still haunted the collective imagination. The system extracted, yes, but it also provided order, stability, the ability to plan beyond the next raid. The price was freedom. For most people, the price seemed worth paying. And above it all, holding the entire structure together, was the church. By the year 1200, the Pope was the most powerful figure in Europe, not in theory, in practice. Pope Innocent III, who reigned from 1198 to 1216, could make and unmake kings. He deposed 2 of them personally, King John of England and Emperor Otto IV of Germany, using weapons no secular ruler could match. Excommunication meant exile from the sacraments, no communion, no confession, no marriage, no last rites, and in a world where everyone believed in hell, that was worse than death. Interdict was even more devastating. An entire kingdom placed under ban, no church services for anyone, baptisms stopped, marriages unblessed, the dead buried without ceremony. When Innocent placed England under interdict in 1208, the population endured 6 years of spiritual terror until John capitulated. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 showed the scope of papal ambition. 1,200 bishops, abbots, and representatives gathered in Rome at Innocent's summons, the largest church council since antiquity, and they defined transubstantiation, the doctrine that bread and wine literally become Christ's body and blood. They mandated annual confession for every Christian. They required Jews to wear identifying badges. They launched a new crusade. They legislated for every soul in Christendom, and everyone obeyed because everyone believed the Pope spoke for God. Innocent himself understood exactly what he was claiming. The Lord left to Peter not only the church, but the whole world to govern. The papacy had become a government, a court system, a university accreditation board, and the final arbiter of every dispute that mattered. Kings knelt before it. Emperors begged for its blessing. The medieval church wasn't a religion in the modern sense, a private matter of individual faith. It was the operating system of civilization. And for 2 centuries, the operating system worked. But here's what Innocent couldn't see from his throne in Rome. The system he commanded, the system that seemed so powerful, so permanent, so blessed by God, had a design flaw. It rested entirely on belief. Everyone had to believe the Pope spoke for God. Everyone had to believe the feudal order was sacred. Everyone had to believe the hierarchy was natural and eternal. The moment that belief cracked, the whole structure would collapse. The cracks were already forming, and nowhere were they more visible than in the Crusader states. The medieval experiment's most exposed edge. Jerusalem, 1177. A 16-year-old king who can barely grip his reins leads a cavalry charge against an army 5 times the size of his own. His name is Baldwin, the 4th of that name to rule the kingdom of Jerusalem, and he is dying. He's been dying since he was 9 years old, when his tutor noticed that the prince didn't flinch during a game that left scratches on his arm. Leprosy. The diagnosis was certain. The prognosis was worse. He would reign, yes, because there was no alternative. But he would reign as his body betrayed him, his nerves deadening, his skin ulcerating, his fingers and toes rotting away while he watched. He became king at 13. By 16, his hands couldn't feel the reins, so they strapped him to his horse and he rode anyway. The kingdom of Jerusalem was never meant to be permanent. Carved from Muslim territory in 1099 during the First Crusade, defended by a few hundred knights 2,000 miles from home, surrounded by enemies with populations 100 times larger. It was a beachhead, not a nation. The Crusaders held it through a combination of military brilliance, diplomatic maneuvering, and the disunity of their opponents. They knew the math. Everyone knew the math. Sooner or later, someone would unite the Muslim world against them. Sooner or later, the reinforcements from Europe would stop coming. Sooner or later, they would lose. Saladin was that someone. Yusuf ibn Ayyub, called Salah ad-Din, the righteousness of the faith. He'd united Egypt and Syria under his command, ended generations of Muslim infighting, assembled the largest army the Crusaders had ever faced. By 1177, he was ready to end the experiment. 26,000 soldiers marched toward Jerusalem. Against them, Baldwin could field perhaps 400 knights and a few thousand infantry. The numbers weren't just unfavorable, they were absurd. 400 against 26,000. The kingdom's entire military force against an enemy that could afford to lose 10 times its number. and still overwhelmed the defenders. Any rational calculation said surrender, or at least retreat to defensible positions and wait for a miracle. Baldwin attacked. The Battle of Montgisard shouldn't have been possible. Saladin's army was spread out, foraging, confident that no crusader force would dare engage. Baldwin caught them scattered near the coast, drove his cavalry straight into their center, shattered formations that had no time to coalesce. The charge was led by Reynold of Chatillon, a former prince of Antioch turned freebooter, a man whose recklessness terrified his own allies as much as his enemies. Behind him rode the Knights Templar, the religious warrior monks who took vows of poverty and then became the richest military force in Christendom. And at the head of it all, strapped to his saddle because his hands couldn't grip, was a 16-year-old boy who couldn't feel pain. Saladin lost 90% of his army that day, perhaps 20,000 dead, captured, scattered. He barely escaped himself, fleeing on a racing camel while his bodyguard died around him. The Crusaders lost maybe 1,000 men. It was one of the most improbable victories in medieval history, and it bought nothing but time. Baldwin knew, he'd always known, the victory at Montgisard would delay Saladin, not stop him. The Crusader states had perhaps 700 resident knights, a number that fluctuated with pilgrims and adventurers from Europe, but rarely climbed much higher. Their enemies could field 30,000 cavalry from Egypt alone, more from Syria, more from territories that stretched to the borders of India. Every knight the Crusaders lost was irreplaceable. Every knight Saladin lost could be replaced 10 times over. The war wasn't a contest. It was arithmetic. Baldwin fought the arithmetic for 8 more years. He fought as his disease progressed, as he went blind, as his extremities rotted and were amputated, as he was carried to council meetings on a litter, because he could no longer walk. The kingdom was him, his will, his intelligence, his refusal to surrender to odds that were already impossible. These were the only things keeping the structure standing. He arranged a marriage for his sister to ensure succession. He navigated the vicious politics of his own court, where factions plotted for the day he died. He made truces with Saladin when he had to, broke them when he saw advantage. He was playing a game he knew he couldn't win, and he played it better than anyone had a right to expect. In 1185, Baldwin died. He was 24 years old. He'd spent half his life as king, all of it dying, and he'd held together a kingdom that had no business existing. Within 2 years, everything he'd built collapsed. His successors blundered into a disastrous battle at Hattin in 1187, lost the entire army, lost the True Cross itself, and lost Jerusalem to Saladin. The victory at Montgisard had bought a decade. A decade was all it was ever going to buy. The Crusader states were a microcosm of the medieval system's fundamental problem. They worked through will, through belief, through the unsustainable effort of exceptional people holding impossible positions. Remove the exceptional people, and the position became simply impossible. Baldwin understood this. Saladin understood this. The tragedy wasn't that Jerusalem fell. The tragedy was that it was always going to fall, and Baldwin fought anyway. The Crusades are remembered as a clash of civilizations. They were also the story of a system overreaching, of medieval Europe's confidence outrunning its capacity, of men who believed God was on their side discovering that God helps those who bring enough cavalry. The Crusaders built castles that still stand, fortifications so sophisticated that Muslim engineers studied them. They established trade routes that would funnel Asian goods into European markets for centuries, and they absorbed ideas and technologies that would transform the West. And they lost. They lost because the math was always against them, and eventually the math caught up. But the system didn't know it was losing. Back in Europe, the cathedrals kept rising. Between 1050 and 1350, France alone quarried more stone than ancient Egypt had in 3,000 years. Chartres, Notre Dame, Reims, Amiens, spires climbing higher than any Roman structure, walls that were more glass than stone, engineering that pushed the limits of what medieval physics could calculate. The builders didn't have modern mathematics. They worked from rules of thumb passed down through generations of masons, and sometimes they got it wrong, and towers collapsed and crushed the workers beneath them, and they built them again, higher. Lincoln Cathedral's spire, completed in 1311, was the tallest structure humans had ever made. It wouldn't be surpassed until the 19th century. This was a civilization that believed in itself, that believed it had surpassed Rome, surpassed antiquity, that the present was better than the past, and the future would be better still. The population was growing. The economy was expanding. The universities were multiplying. Paris, Oxford, Bologna, institutions that would outlast everything else the Middle Ages built. The law was being codified, written down, systematized. The vernacular languages were producing literature, Dante and Chaucer, works that could stand beside anything the Romans had created. And then the weather changed. The spring of 1315 came late. Too late. The rain started in May and didn't stop. Crops rotted in the fields across northern Europe. The summer harvest failed. The fall planting drowned. By winter, the grain stores were exhausted. By the following spring, people were eating dogs, cats, rats, things they wouldn't name. There are documented cases of cannibalism. Peasants dug up corpses for food. Parents abandoned children. The reports have the quality of nightmare, except the nightmares went on for 3 years. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed between 10 and 25% of Northern Europe's population. Millions dead. Not from war, not from plague, from rain. From weather that the medieval agricultural system couldn't survive. The system had expanded to its limits, cultivated every acre that could be cultivated, cleared every forest that could be cleared, and when the limits were tested, the limits broke. The population didn't fully recover before the next blow fell. But for a generation, survivors could convince themselves that 1315 was an anomaly, a divine punishment perhaps, something that wouldn't happen again. The cathedrals were still standing. The church was still powerful. The kings were still crowned. The system had taken a punch and stayed upright. Meanwhile, the church itself was hemorrhaging authority. In 1309, Pope Clement V moved the papal court from Rome to Avignon, a city in southern France, effectively placing himself under the protection of the French king. The reasons were complicated, involving Italian politics, French pressure, Clement's own French background. The symbolism was simple. The successor of Peter, the rock on which Christ built his church, had abandoned Rome. For nearly 70 years, and the popes would remain in Avignon, their independence compromised, their moral authority cracking. Petrarch called it the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. He wasn't wrong. By 1340, Europe had recovered from the famine. The population was growing again. The system had demonstrated resilience. If you stood in Paris or Florence or London in that year, you might have believed the worst was over. You might have believed the medieval experiment had proven itself, that the order built from the ruins of Rome could endure anything, that God was indeed on Christendom's side. You would have been wrong. Because in 1346, in a trading post called Kaffa on the coast of the Black Sea, Mongol armies besieging the city began catapulting infected corpses over the walls. The Italian merchants inside fled by ship, carrying their cargo with them. The cargo included rats. The rats carried fleas. The fleas carried Yersinia pestis. The death ships reached Messina in October of 1347. Most of the crew was already dead. The harbor masters ordered them to leave immediately. It was already too late. The medieval system had built trade networks that connected Constantinople to London, that moved silks and spices and ideas across a continent. Those same networks would now carry something else. The supply chains that made medieval prosperity possible became highways for bacterial annihilation. The connections that bound Christendom together would ensure that when death came, it came everywhere at once. Baldwin IV had fought arithmetic and lost. He'd known the numbers were against him, and he'd fought anyway, because fighting was all he had. Europe was about to face arithmetic too. Well, not the arithmetic of cavalry and castles. The arithmetic of mortality. 1 in 3, maybe 1 in 2. The Black Death wasn't going to be a disaster. It was going to be an ending. The ships came into Messina harbor on an October evening in 1347, and the harbor master knew immediately that something was wrong. 12 Genoese galleys, trading vessels that should have carried crews of hundreds, drifted toward the docks with almost no one visible on deck. The few sailors who stumbled to the rails moved like men already half dead, clutching their sides, collapsing against the rigging. When the harbor master's men boarded the first ship, they found the hold full of corpses. The living had black swellings the size of eggs in their armpits and groins, skin mottled with dark blotches, breath coming in gasps that sprayed blood. The smell was unlike anything the Sicilians had encountered, a sweetness that clung to the throat and wouldn't leave. The harbor master ordered the ships out of the harbor immediately. The Genoese sailors were dying anyway, he reasoned. Let them die at sea. The galleys were pushed back from the docks, left to drift in the Mediterranean, their crews screaming for help that wouldn't come. It was already far too late. The rats had already left the ships. The fleas had already found new hosts. In the warehouses along the Messina waterfront, in the homes of merchants who had helped unload cargo before the order came, in the bodies of dock workers who had touched rope and crate and cloth, Yersinia pestis was already multiplying. The harbor master himself would be dead within the week. He didn't know it yet. None of them knew it yet. The plague moved faster than any army. Messina to Catania in days. Sicily to the Italian mainland within weeks. By January 1348, it had reached Genoa and Venice, the great trading cities whose networks connected every port in the Mediterranean. By March, it was in Florence. By June, Paris. By autumn, London. By the following year, Scandinavia. The medieval economy had built a transportation system that could move silk from China and spices from India across continents in months. That same system now moved death at the speed of commerce. The mechanism was invisible to everyone who lived through it. They couldn't see the bacteria. They couldn't see the fleas. They understood that the disease spread from person to person, that fleeing a plague city brought the plague with you. But the how remained mysterious. Physicians consulted Galen and Hippocrates and found nothing useful. The best medical advice of the era recommended burning aromatic herbs, carrying flowers to ward off bad air, avoiding bathing because open pores let the pestilence enter. None of it worked. The doctors who got close enough to examine patients died at rates higher than anyone else. The astrologers blamed a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars that had occurred in 1345. The theologians blamed sin. The conspiracy theorists blamed Jews, claiming they had poisoned the wells of Christendom. In Strasbourg, In February 1349, the city council debated what to do about its Jewish population. Some argued for protection. More argued for expulsion. What actually happened was murder. 2,000 Jews were taken to the Jewish cemetery and burned alive, and their property was distributed among the Christian citizens. The debts that Christians owed to Jewish moneylenders were conveniently annulled. Similar massacres occurred across Germany, Switzerland, and France. Pope Clement VI issued bulls defending the Jews, pointing out that they were dying of plague at the same rate as everyone else, that poisoned wells couldn't explain a disease that struck cities without Jewish populations. No one listened. The killing continued until there were no more Jews to kill. The flagellants appeared in the same months. Processions of men, sometimes women, marching from town to town, stripped to the waist, whipping themselves with leather thongs embedded with iron spikes. They believed they could absorb God's punishment on behalf of humanity, that their suffering could appease divine wrath and stop the plague. The processions drew crowds in the hundreds, sometimes thousands. The flagellants would enter a town square, form a circle, and begin. The whips rose and fell in rhythm. Blood ran down their backs and pooled on the cobblestones. The watching crowds wept, prayed, sometimes joined in. The spectacle lasted until the flagellants collapsed from exhaustion. Then they moved on to the next town. The church eventually banned the movement, recognizing that it had escaped clerical control and was developing its own theology, its own rituals, its own implicit criticism of established religion. But the ban came late, and by then, the flagellants had revealed something that couldn't be unseen. The official church had no answers. Priests were dying like everyone else. Prayers weren't stopping the plague. The sacraments that were supposed to guarantee salvation required priests to administer them, and the priests were either dead or fled. In Florence, a young writer named Giovanni Boccaccio watched the city he loved dissolve into chaos. He would later describe what he saw in the introduction to the Decameron, and his account remains one of the most devastating eyewitness testimonies in literature. The sick were abandoned by their families. Servants refused to tend their masters. Parents abandoned children, and children abandoned parents. The burial customs that had defined Florentine society for generations, the elaborate funerals, the mourning rituals, the careful placement of bodies in family tombs, all of it collapsed under the weight of corpses that couldn't be processed fast enough. Mass graves were dug outside the city walls. Bodies were stacked like cargo in a ship's hold, a layer of corpses, a layer of dirt, another layer of corpses, until the pit was full. Boccaccio's response to the horror was unexpected. He wrote a book about 10 young Florentines who flee the plague to a country villa and entertain themselves with stories, most of them bawdy, many of them satirizing the clergy, almost all of them focused on pleasure, wit, and the comedy of human desire. It was an act of defiance. The world was ending, and Boccaccio insisted that life was still worth celebrating, that laughter still mattered, that human beings could create beauty even in the midst of annihilation. The Decameron wasn't religious consolation. It was secular humanism, a declaration that meaning could be found in this world rather than the next, when the plague, paradoxically, helped give birth to the Renaissance. But these were the responses of the survivors who could afford to respond. For most people, there was no philosophy, no explanation, no consolation. There was only the disease. The bubonic form killed in 3 to 5 days. It began with fever, headache, exhaustion. Then the buboes appeared, swellings in the lymph nodes of the groin, armpits, and neck. They grew to the size of eggs, sometimes apples, stretched the skin until it turned purple-black, eventually burst and leaked pus and blood. The pain was excruciating. The smell was unbearable. Most victims died before the buboes burst, their bodies consuming themselves in fever. The pneumonic form was faster. It attacked the lungs, filled them with fluid, turned every breath into agony. Victims coughed blood, couldn't breathe, drowned from the inside. This form killed in 1 to 2 days, sometimes hours. It spread through the air from cough to breath, requiring no rats, no fleas, just proximity to someone already dying. Families that shared beds shared death. The septicemic form was fastest of all. The bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, multiplied beyond the body's ability to fight, caused massive internal hemorrhaging. Victims developed dark blotches across their skin as blood pooled beneath the surface. They could be healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner. This form was almost always fatal and almost always fast. The mathematics were simple and annihilating. In a typical medieval city, perhaps 1 person in 20 was infected in the first week of an outbreak. Each infected person spread the disease to several others before dying. By the second week, 1 in 10 was sick. By the third week, 1 in 5. By the fourth week, the city was a charnel house. The living couldn't bury the dead. The dead lay in houses, in streets, in the beds where they had been abandoned by terrified families. Dogs ate corpses that no one removed. Rats, the very creatures that had spread the plague, feasted on the remains. And here, in this nightmare, we find Agnolo di Tura. He was a shoemaker in Siena, a prosperous Italian city-state that had been building one of the most ambitious cathedrals in Christendom. He was also a minor civic official, one of those citizens who kept records, attended council meetings, felt invested in his community's future. He had a wife. He had 5 children. He had a life that, by medieval standards, was comfortable and full of promise. The plague reached Siena in May 1348. By August, his wife was dead. His children were sick, and there was no one to help. The gravediggers had died, or fled, or refused to work for any price. The priests who should have administered last rites were themselves dying at rates higher than the general population, because their duty required them to be in the room with death, to hear confessions, to touch the sick, to comfort the dying. The social infrastructure that humans rely on to process catastrophe had simply ceased to exist. Agnolo did what no father should ever have to do. He dug graves in his own garden. He carried his children's bodies, one by one, wrapped in whatever cloth he could find. He lowered them into the ground with his own hands. He covered them with dirt while his hands shook and his heart broke and the world around him continued to die. And I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands. That sentence, written in his Chronicle of the Plague, is one of the most devastating lines in medieval literature. It needs no elaboration. It needs no explanation. A father, alone, burying his children. That's the Black Death. That's what it meant. Not the statistics, not the death tolls, not the percentages that historians would calculate centuries later. A man with a shovel, standing over small graves, trying to understand how the world could permit such things. Agnolo survived. He remarried eventually. He had more children. He watched Siena try to rebuild, try to complete the cathedral that had been the city's pride before the disaster, and they never finished it. The planned expansion was too ambitious for a population that had been cut in half. The wall where construction stopped is still visible today, a wound the city still wears. Agnolo lived another 20 years, keeping his chronicle, recording what he saw, making sure someone would remember. Siena lost over half its population in the summer of 1348. 50,000 people, perhaps more. The city had been a major power in Italian politics, a rival to Florence, a center of banking and trade and art. After the plague, it was a backwater. The population never recovered. The ambitions never recovered. A city that had planned to build the largest cathedral in Italy was too broken to finish what it started. This was the pattern everywhere. The plague didn't just kill individuals, it killed communities. It killed the accumulated knowledge of how to do things, the master craftsmen who had spent decades learning their trades, the merchants who knew the trade routes, the administrators who kept records no one else could read. A generation of expertise vanished in months. The survivors were often the young, the unskilled, the people who happened to have natural immunity or happened to avoid exposure. They inherited a world built by people who were now dead, and they had to figure out how to run it with a fraction of the knowledge. The clergy died at rates that varied by region, but were consistently devastating. In some dioceses, 2/3 of priests died. In some monasteries, everyone died. The church's human infrastructure, the thousands of men who ran parishes and heard confessions and administered sacraments, was gutted. The replacements who were hastily ordained were often barely trained, barely literate, chosen because they were available rather than qualified. The quality of religious leadership, which had never been uniformly high, collapsed. Parishioners noticed. They noticed that their new priest couldn't read Latin, couldn't answer theological questions, seemed as confused and frightened as everyone else. The nobles died too. The plague was no respecter of social rank. Kings lost heirs. Dukes lost entire family lines. The careful accumulation of power and property and connection that defined noble families was disrupted in ways that took generations to sort out. Inheritance disputes multiplied. Wars broke out over estates that had no clear heirs. The political stability that the feudal system had, for all its violence, and managed to provide, was shaken at its foundations, and the peasants, the vast majority who worked the land and fed everyone else, they died in numbers that transformed the medieval economy. The first wave of plague ended around 1351, not because anyone had defeated it, but because it ran out of susceptible hosts. The survivors had some immunity. The dead couldn't spread it further. The disease retreated, but it didn't disappear. It returned in 1361, killing many of the children born since the first wave. It returned again in 1369 and 1374, and kept returning for the next 3 centuries. Each wave was smaller than the first, but each wave killed, and the population didn't fully recover until the 1500s. The long-term numbers are almost incomprehensible. England's population fell from roughly 4.5 million before the plague to perhaps 2.5 million by 1400. That's not a statistic. That's nearly half the population of an entire country erased in 2 generations. France suffered similarly. Italy, worse in some regions. The Mediterranean coastal areas, the trading cities, the places most connected to the networks that spread the plague, were the places hit hardest. And in this devastation, something unexpected began to grow. The peasants who survived found themselves in a new world. Before the plague, land was the scarce resource and labor was abundant. Lords could dictate terms because there were always more peasants than plots to work. After the plague, the equation reversed. Labor was scarce. Land was abundant. For the first time in centuries, the people who worked the soil had leverage, and they used it. Peasants began demanding higher wages. When lords refused, they walked away, found lords who would pay more. The old bonds that had tied families to specific manners for generations began to dissolve. Why stay where your grandfather had been a serf when the next valley over, someone was offering twice the wage and fewer restrictions? The market, which had been suppressed by custom and law and force for centuries, reasserted itself. The lords fought back with legislation. England's Statute of Laborers in 1351 tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, tried to make it illegal for workers to demand more or employers to pay more. The law was widely ignored. You cannot legislate against supply and demand when supply has been cut in half. Other countries tried similar measures with similar results. The feudal system, which had seemed as permanent as the seasons, was breaking down, and no amount of legal coercion could put it back together. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was the most dramatic eruption of this new world. 60,000 English rebels marched on London, demanding the abolition of serfdom, the punishment of corrupt officials, the redistribution of church wealth. They executed the Archbishop of Canterbury. They burned legal records that documented their obligations. They met the young King Richard II at Mile End and heard him promise everything they wanted. The promises were lies. Once the rebels dispersed, the king's forces hunted down the leaders. Wat Tyler, who had led the London contingent, was stabbed to death during a parley. John Ball, the priest whose sermons had inspired the uprising, was hanged, drawn, and quartered. The immediate revolt was crushed. But you cannot crush an economic reality. Within a generation, wages had doubled across England. Within a century, serfdom was effectively dead, replaced by wage labor and tenant farming, and the beginnings of something that would eventually be called a market economy. The Black Death didn't just kill people. It killed an economic system that had endured for 500 years. The psychological damage was harder to measure, but no less real. An entire generation grew up in a world where death was constant, where the normal rituals of grief and burial had been abandoned, where the institutions that were supposed to provide meaning had failed utterly. The art of the period reflects this trauma. Dances of death showing skeletons leading popes and kings and peasants alike to the grave are reminders that mortality was universal and could come at any moment. The cheerful confidence of the High Middle Ages, the sense that European civilization was blessed by God and destined for greatness, was damaged in ways that wouldn't fully heal. Some found new meaning in pleasure. Boccaccio's Decameron was widely imitated. A certain hedonism entered European culture, a sense that life was short and uncertain and should be enjoyed while it lasted. The flagellants had their answer, and the hedonists had theirs, and both were responses to the same question. How do you live when everything you believed has been proven hollow? Some found meaning in doubt. The Church's failure during the plague, the obvious helplessness of prayer, the death of priests who were supposed to be protected by God. All of this planted seeds of skepticism that would eventually bloom into the Reformation. If the Pope couldn't stop the plague, if priests couldn't save their own congregations, if the sacraments provided no actual protection, then what exactly was the Church good for? The question was asked in whispers in 1350. It would be shouted from pulpits by 1517, and some found meaning in work. The labor shortage created opportunities for survivors who had ambition and skill. Peasants became yeoman farmers. Craftsmen became guild masters. Merchants expanded into territories left vacant by the dead. The rigid hierarchy of the medieval world, where your birth determined your destiny, was cracked. Not shattered, not yet, but cracked. People could move upward in ways that had been nearly impossible before. the social mobility that we consider normal, the idea that hard work can improve your station. This was born in the chaos after the plague. The plague didn't end the Middle Ages by itself. The cathedrals still stood. The kings still ruled. The church still claimed authority. The peasants still worked the land, even if they demanded more for their labor. The structures of medieval life persisted for another century and more. But something fundamental had broken. The confidence, the sense of permanence, the belief that the medieval order was ordained by God and would last forever. That was gone. The survivors knew, in a way their ancestors hadn't known, that everything could be taken away. That no amount of piety or power or wealth could protect you from a death that chose its victims without regard for rank or virtue. That the world their grandparents had believed in was a world that no longer existed. They buried their dead. They rebuilt what they could. They passed the trauma to their children and their children's children, and the memory of the plague haunted European culture for centuries. When Shakespeare wrote about mortality, when Renaissance painters depicted death, when the Reformation tore Christendom apart, the Black Death was still there, underneath, a wound that had scarred over but never fully healed. The medieval world had survived Viking raids and Mongol invasions and the collapse of Charlemagne's empire. It had survived famines and wars and schisms in the church, but it couldn't survive losing a third of its people in 3 years. The system was too fragile, too dependent on labor that was suddenly scarce, too dependent on belief that had been shattered. What came next would be built on different foundations, not the tight hierarchy of lord and serf, but the looser connections of employer and employee, not the unquestioned authority of the church, but the skepticism that would eventually produce the Reformation, not the isolation of medieval manners, but the expanding networks of trade that would eventually reach across oceans. The modern world was being born in the graveyards of the medieval one. Agnolo di Tura lived to see some of this transformation. He watched Siena struggle and adapt and survive. He watched his new children grow up in a world their dead siblings would never have recognized. He kept writing, kept recording, kept making sure that what had happened would not be forgotten. And so many died, he wrote, down that everyone believed it was the end of the world. It wasn't the end, but it was an ending. The medieval world didn't fall to an army or an invasion. It fell to a bacterium so small that no one would see it for another 500 years. It fell to rats and fleas and the trade routes that medieval merchants had built with such pride. It fell to its own success, to the connections that made it prosperous and made it vulnerable. The survivors inherited a broken world. What they built from the wreckage would carry the scars of what they had lost. And the question they faced, the question that hung over everything that came after, was whether anything they built would be worth the price they had paid. The plague burned itself out the way fires do, by running out of fuel. By 1353, the first wave had passed. The gravediggers who survived had more work than they could handle, and then suddenly, they had none. The death carts stopped rolling. The mass graves stopped filling. Europe looked up from its nightmare and took stock of what remained. The numbers were almost impossible to process. Somewhere between a third and half of everyone was gone. Not wounded, not displaced, not impoverished. Gone. Every third house empty. Every second workshop silent. The fields that had been carefully cultivated for generations now grew wild because there was no one to work them. In some villages, the last survivor locked the door and walked away, and the village simply ceased to exist. Archaeologists still find them, these abandoned settlements, wells filled in, churches crumbling, the outlines of streets visible only from the air. And the plague didn't just kill people. It erased communities that had existed for centuries. And yet, the survivors had something their ancestors hadn't possessed for 1,000 years. They had leverage. When half the workforce dies, the other half discovers something remarkable about supply and demand. Peasants who had been bound to the land for generations, who had worked 3 days a week for their lords and paid fees to marry and fees to die and fees to use the mill that ground their grain, these peasants suddenly found themselves being courted. Lords needed labor. Labor was scarce. For the first time in memory, peasants could negotiate. They could demand higher wages. They could threaten to leave for the next manor, where the lord was more desperate. They could, for the first time, imagine a life that wasn't defined by the accident of where they were born. The lords, predictably, panicked. England's Statute of Laborers, passed in 1351, tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It tried to make it illegal for workers to demand more, illegal for employers to pay more, illegal for the market to function as markets function. The law failed. You cannot legislate against arithmetic. When there are 2 workers for every 10 jobs, workers set the terms. The lords discovered that force of arms, which had kept the system stable for centuries, was useless against peasants who simply refused to cooperate and walked away to better offers. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was the system's fever breaking. 60,000 English rebels marched on London, demanding the end of serfdom, the end of feudal obligations, the end of the entire structure that had defined their lives and their parents' lives and their grandparents' lives for as long as anyone could remember. They executed the Archbishop of Canterbury. They burned tax records. They met the 14-year-old King Richard II at Mile End and extracted promises of reform that seemed, for one extraordinary moment, to herald the end of medieval hierarchy. The promises were lies. Once the rebels dispersed, Richard hunted down their leaders and hanged them. The immediate revolt failed. But something had broken that couldn't be repaired. Within a generation, wages had doubled. Within a century, serfdom in England was effectively dead, replaced by wage labor and tenant farming. The plague didn't end the medieval system by itself. It shifted the balance of power so fundamentally that the system could no longer sustain itself. The survivors of the Black Death didn't overthrow feudalism. They made it economically unviable. The church, meanwhile, was hemorrhaging something more precious than money. It was losing credibility. Clergy had died at higher rates than the general population during the plague. This wasn't because God had abandoned them. It was because they were supposed to administer last rites, to hear confessions, to comfort the dying. Their job was to be in the room with death. Many of them honored that duty and paid the price. But many others had fled. Priests who were supposed to shepherd their flocks abandoned their parishes. Bishops who were supposed to model faith retreated to isolated estates. The survivors noticed. They noticed that piety offered no protection, that prayer hadn't stopped the plague, that the institution claiming to speak for God had been just as helpless, just as terrified, just as mortal as everyone else. The Great Schism made it worse. From 1378 to 1417, there were 2 popes, sometimes 3, each excommunicating the followers of the others, each claiming exclusive divine authority, each demanding obedience that could only be given to one. If the Pope was Christ's vicar on earth, how could there be 2 of them, or 3? The theological tangles were absurd enough to make lay people wonder whether any of it meant anything at all. Reform movements began demanding change. Jan Hus in Bohemia, John Wycliffe in England, voices questioning not just papal authority, but the entire structure of mediated salvation, and the Church burned them as heretics. A century later, it would fail to burn Martin Luther fast enough, and the medieval religious order would shatter completely. But that was the future. In 1405, in Paris, a widow sat at a writing desk and did something almost unthinkable. Christine de Pizan had been born in Venice, raised at the French court where her father served as the king's astrologer, married happily at 15 to a royal secretary. When her husband died in an epidemic in 1390, she was 25 with 3 children, an elderly mother to support, and no legal standing whatsoever. Medieval law treated widows as perpetual dependents. She could remarry and become another man's responsibility. She could enter a convent and become God's responsibility. Or she could throw herself on the mercy of relatives. These were her options. The system offered nothing else. Christine refused the options. She started writing poetry, using the skills she'd absorbed at court, the Latin and French and Italian she'd learned from her scholar father. She wrote about her grief at first, safe women's topics, emotional terrain the male literary establishment would tolerate. But she was good. She was better than good. The poems circulated, found admirers, attracted patrons. Nobles began paying for her work. The Duke of Burgundy commissioned pieces. The Queen of France became a patron. Christine de Pizan became, as far as historians can determine, the first woman in European history to support herself and her family entirely through writing. And then she got angry. The Roman de la Rose was one of the most popular texts of the Middle Ages, a vast allegorical poem that included extended passages describing women as deceitful, lustful, incapable of virtue, deserving of domination. It was standard medieval fare, misogyny dressed up as philosophy, the kind of thing men had been writing for centuries. Christine attacked it. She wrote rebuttals that circulated among the same educated audience that revered the original. She argued that women's supposed weaknesses were products of education and opportunity, not nature. She named the bias, cataloged the contradictions, demanded that readers confront what they had been taught to accept. In 1405, she wrote the Book of the City of Ladies. It was a counter-canon, an imaginary city populated by women of history and mythology, queens and saints and warriors and scholars, evidence that women had always been capable of everything men claimed they couldn't do. The book was popular. It was copied, translated, distributed across Europe. 500 years before anyone used the word feminism, Christine de Pizan was doing feminist historiography. Not all men, and especially not the wisest, share the opinion that it is bad for women to be educated. That line has the quality of a bomb buried in a garden. Polite, reasonable, devastating. The very existence of Christine's career was an argument against everything the medieval system believed about women. The system said women couldn't think independently. Christine thought independently. The system said women belonged to men. Christine belonged to herself. The system said women's voices didn't matter. Christine's voice mattered enough that powerful men paid to hear it. She lived long enough to see Joan of Arc. The last work Christine wrote, in 1429, was a poem celebrating the peasant girl who led armies and crowned a king. 2 women at the edge of the medieval world, each impossible by the system's own logic, each proof that the walls weren't as solid as they looked. Christine died around 1430. We don't know exactly when or where. Her books survived. Her city of ladies still stands. The medieval system defined women through their relationships to men: daughter, wife, widow, nun. Christine de Pizan lived in none of those categories. She found a crack in the structure and built a life there. What she proved, simply by existing, was that the structure had cracks. That given the smallest opportunity, the smallest opening, people would escape into lives the system never imagined. The entire Middle Ages might be understood through cracks, through improvisation, adaptation, survival in spaces the official order didn't acknowledge. The barbarian kingdoms that took Roman titles while building something new. The monasteries that preserved learning by making it sacred. The peasants who knew the feudal contract was exploitation and accepted it anyway, because the alternative was chaos. The merchants who accumulated wealth that the system said only nobles should have. The universities that questioned doctrines the church said were settled. The artists who painted human faces on saints and made the sacred look disturbingly earthly. The medieval period wasn't a monolith. It was 1,000 years of pressure and adaptation, orthodoxy and subversion, rules and the people who bent them. It was a world that insisted everything was ordained by God and permanent, while changing constantly. The contradictions were the engine. The cracks were where the future grew. And what grew in those cracks became the world you live in. Consider what the Middle Ages actually produced. Not the cathedrals, though those are impressive enough. Not the illuminated manuscripts, though the patience required to create them should humble anyone. The institutions, the infrastructure of the modern world, universities, Paris, Oxford, Bologna, institutions that invented the degree system, the lecture format, the idea of academic freedom. Medieval scholars fought bitterly over the right of universities to govern themselves, to teach without interference from kings or bishops. They won. That victory is why tenure exists. Every university on earth, from Harvard to Tokyo to São Paulo, descends from medieval models, follows medieval structures, awards medieval credentials. The bachelor's degree is a relic of medieval guild organization. The cap and gown is clerical dress. The ceremony where you receive your diploma is a ritual invented in the 12th century. Parliaments. The English Parliament began as a medieval instrument for raising taxes, a way for the king to get consent from the nobles and eventually the commoners for funds he couldn't extract by force. The principle that the king couldn't tax without representation, that there were limits on royal power, that subjects had rights the crown had to respect. This was medieval. Magna Carta in 1215 wasn't a declaration of democracy. It was a feudal document, a list of baronial privileges. But embedded in that list were principles that would expand over centuries into constitutional government. The legal theory that powers you vote, that makes legislatures possible, that insists governments need consent. This has medieval fingerprints all over it. Law. Roman law rediscovered and systematized. Canon law, the church's legal code, creating the first rationalized bureaucratic legal system in European history. Common law in England, where precedent and custom accumulated into a structure that could adapt without collapsing. The idea that law was knowable, written, consistent. This was a medieval achievement. When lawyers cite precedents, when judges interpret statutes, when contracts are enforced, they're working in a framework medieval jurists built. Banking. Medieval Italian merchants invented double-entry bookkeeping. They invented letters of credit that let you transfer money across continents without physically moving gold. They invented the corporate structures that let multiple investors pool resources for ventures too large for any individual. The Medici, the Fuggers, the great trading houses, these were medieval institutions. Capitalism didn't begin in the Industrial Revolution. It began in medieval Florence and Venice and Bruges, in counting houses where merchants tracked debits and credits in systems we still use today. The list continues. Insurance, invented to cover maritime risk on medieval trading voyages. Patents, medieval grants of monopoly to encourage innovation. Hospitals, standardized under medieval church administration. Eyeglasses, first produced in 13th century Italy. Mechanical clocks, medieval inventions that synchronized the European day and eventually made industrial time discipline possible. The printing press itself, Gutenberg's revolution, was built from medieval technologies. The wine press, oil-based inks, metallurgical techniques developed in medieval forges. And yet, we call them the Dark Ages. The term was invented by Petrarch in the 14th century, a self-serving piece of propaganda. He wanted to position his own era as a revival of classical greatness, and that required the intervening millennium to be a gap, a pause, an embarrassment. Renaissance thinkers extended the insult. Enlightenment philosophers made it doctrine. Medieval became synonymous with backward, primitive, irrational. We still use it that way. When we call something medieval, we mean cruel, ignorant, obsolete. This is one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in history. 500 years and counting. The people who created the myth had reasons. Every era wants to feel like a culmination. The Renaissance claimed to have revived antiquity after 1,000 years of sleep. The Enlightenment claimed to have overthrown superstition after 1,000 years of darkness. Each needed the Middle Ages to be awful so they could be heroes. The myth served their purposes. It still serves our purposes. It lets us feel modern, rational, liberated from a past we've successfully transcended. The truth is more uncomfortable. The medieval world was violent, superstitious, oppressive, hierarchical. It burned heretics. It persecuted Jews. It treated women as property. It blessed conquest and called it crusade. All of this is true. It's also true that every era, including this one, has its violences and superstitions and oppressions. The medieval period didn't invent human cruelty. It inherited cruelty from Rome and passed it on to modernity with refinements. What distinguishes the Middle Ages isn't that it was worse than what came before or after. What distinguishes it is that we've agreed to use it as a repository for everything we want to believe we've outgrown. The Crusade mentality didn't end when the Crusades did. The persecution of minorities didn't end when the medieval period did. The idea that violence can solve ideological conflicts, that God blesses conquest, that some people matter more than others, none of these died in 1500 or 1517 or any other conventional end date. The colonial empires that carved up the globe in the centuries after the Middle Ages used medieval logic, divine mission, civilizing duty, the obligation to bring light to darkness. They used it on scales medieval crusaders never imagined. We stand on medieval shoulders and pretend we're floating. Your degree is medieval. Your parliament is medieval. Your legal rights descend from medieval charters. Your economy runs on medieval accounting principles. The very idea that ordinary people's languages were worth writing in, that vernacular literature could be as valuable as Latin, that was a medieval breakthrough. You're reading this in a vernacular language because medieval writers proved it could be done. Christine de Pizan wrote in French, not Latin. She wrote for readers who couldn't access the classical tradition directly. She democratized knowledge, in her small way, centuries before the printing press made democratization inevitable. And the printing press itself, which we credit with ending the medieval world, was a medieval machine. Gutenberg was a medieval craftsman using medieval technologies to solve a medieval problem. The break we imagine between medieval and modern is a line we drew in retrospect. The people who crossed it didn't know they were crossing anything. History doesn't have chapter breaks. We impose them afterward. Time jump. 1528. A painting is completed in Germany. Hans Holbein the Younger has painted a double portrait of two French ambassadors, wealthy men surrounded by the instruments of Renaissance learning, globes and lutes and astronomical tools. The painting celebrates humanism, the rediscovery of classical knowledge, everything the Renaissance claimed to represent. But there's something wrong with the floor. A strange smear, a blur. If you stand at the right angle, the blur resolves into a skull, a reminder of death hidden in a celebration of life. The medieval tradition of memento mori, remember you will die, smuggled into a Renaissance painting. The old world haunted the new. It haunts us still. Agnolo di Tura, the Sienese chronicler who buried his 5 children with his own hands, lived another 20 years after the plague. He remarried. He had more children. He watched Siena try to rebuild itself, try to complete the cathedral that had been the city's pride before the disaster. They never finished it. The planned expansion was too ambitious for a population that had been cut in half. The wall where construction stopped is still visible today, a scar the city wears. Agnolo's chronicle survives because someone copied it, and someone copied that copy, and someone preserved those copies through the centuries that followed. His grief became evidence. His specificity, his willingness to record what he saw and felt, became the reason we remember him. Baldwin IV, the leper king, has no tomb. His body was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, but when Saladin took the city in 1187, the crusader graves were eventually lost. We don't know where his bones rest, or if they rest anywhere. His kingdom outlasted him by less than 3 years. His victories delayed the inevitable by a decade. His suffering accomplished nothing permanent and everything meaningful. He knew he was dying from the day he was diagnosed. He fought anyway. Not because he believed he would win, but because fighting was the only answer he had to a question that had no good answer. Charlemagne's empire fragmented within a generation of his death. The Holy Roman Empire that claimed descent from his coronation was neither holy nor Roman, nor an empire, as Voltaire would later observe, but the idea that Europe could be unified, that Christendom was a single civilization with a shared destiny. That idea outlived every failure to achieve it. The European Union, whatever its flaws, is a distant descendant of Charlemagne's ambition. The dream refused to die, even when the dreamers did. And Romulus Augustulus, the boy who signed away Rome. He lived out his days in that villa in Campania, on his pension of 6,000 gold solidi per year, watching the empire he'd nominally ruled dissolve into chaos and barbarian kingdoms. We don't know when he died. We don't know if he married, had children, left any mark on the world at all. History forgot him the moment he became irrelevant. He was the last emperor of Rome, and his name appears in fewer sources than the most obscure provincial governors of the 3rd century. He was important enough to end an empire and unimportant enough that no one recorded his death. But somewhere in those years of comfortable obscurity, while the roads cracked and the aqueducts went dry and the population of Italy collapsed around him, Romulus must have wondered. He must have looked at the ruins of everything his ancestors built and asked whether any of it had mattered, whether the empire had been worth building, whether civilization itself was worth the effort, and given that it would eventually be signed away by a frightened teenager who had no choice. The answer, if there is one, took 1,000 years to articulate. It took Charlemagne trying to rebuild from rubble. It took the monks copying manuscripts they couldn't read. It took the feudal system holding chaos at bay long enough for something else to grow. It took the cathedrals, those insane acts of faith that took 2 centuries to complete, built by workers who knew they would never see the finished spires. It took the plague killing half of everyone, and the survivors demanding something better. It took Christine de Pizan writing herself into existence in defiance of everything her society believed about what women could do. The answer is that civilization is not a thing you build once. It's a thing you rebuild constantly, from whatever materials you have, in the face of whatever catastrophe comes next. The Romans built it. The Franks rebuilt it. The plague survivors rebuilt it again. Each version was different. Each version was imperfect. Each version was the best they could do with what they had. We are still rebuilding. The institutions you live inside, the nations and universities and legal systems and economies, these are medieval constructions, renovated and expanded, but structurally unchanged. The ideas you argue about, rights and representation and the limits of power, these are medieval questions, still unresolved. The problems you can't solve, inequality and violence, and the tension between faith and reason, these are medieval problems, still unsolved. The Middle Ages didn't end, it evolved. What we call the Renaissance was a medieval project that changed its name. What we call the Reformation was a medieval debate that escalated. What we call the modern world is a medieval building with updated plumbing. And the people who lived through all of it, the emperors and warlords and peasants and chroniclers and writers, they didn't know they were in the middle of anything. They thought they were at the end or at the beginning, or simply surviving until tomorrow. They measured themselves against a Roman past they couldn't match, and a Christian future they couldn't see. They did not know that what they built would become the foundation of everything that followed. They were just trying not to die, just trying to leave something behind. A final image, a medieval manuscript page, handwritten, illuminated in gold and blue. The text is a chronicle, or a poem, or a philosophical treatise. It doesn't matter which. In the margin, so small you almost miss it, a monk has drawn a figure, a tiny person, crudely sketched, peering out from the edge of the page, looking at something beyond the vellum, looking at whoever would one day hold this page and try to understand. The figure has no name. The monk who drew it has no name. The page itself has survived fire and flood and war and neglect, passed from hand to hand across centuries, and now it sits in a climate-controlled archive, preserved for a future the monk couldn't imagine. The Middle Ages lasted 1,000 years. It created the world you recognize and the problems you inherit. It wasn't an intermission between ancient glory and modern progress. It was the main act. Everything since has been epilogue. If you made it this far, you've spent 2 hours inside a millennium that's still shaping your life. Here's the question I want you to answer in the comments. What medieval institution are you most surprised to learn you're still living inside? And if you want to understand how the plague changed everything, not just the dying, but the rebuilding, the next video goes deeper into the world that emerged from the mass graves. The survivors built something we weren't expecting.